chemicals.
Delicious aspartame.
I'll just stick with water.
You're missing out on the health benefits that aspartame provides.
Yeah.
They're
all those wonderful health benefits.
Well documented. It's not only that, it has a little bit of caffeine, to get me going, and also a distinct flavor of aluminum. It's delicious.
I bet.
Not a fan of aluminum?
No.
Not a fan of anything?
No.
Hey, everybody.
I like turkey.
This is kind of turkey.
I just had some cracked pepper turkey.
Ooh.
A lot spicier than I thought it was going to be, but it was good.
Yeah. Oh, did it have kind of that orange little rub around the edges?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's when you know your turkey's extra spicy.
Yeah,
and it's going to be a little less, I don't know, sometimes it's off-putting.
It was pretty good.
All right, well, I'll take your word for it. I'm done with that kind of stuff. I'm an old man, and anytime I try something spicy, I'm like, it burns my tongue. So anyway, hey everybody, and welcome to Camera Academy, where we'll be talking about photography rather than cold cuts. Isn't that right, Nikolai, my wonderful co-host?
We could talk about cold cuts, but...
Well, that's one of those tangents that I would normally go on, but in the context of a photography podcast, probably not. But anyway, that's Nikolai, and I'm Nick, and we're from Cometa Camera, and we're at cometa.com, where you can get all of your cameras and lenses and other photography accessories. Anything you need, we've got there at cometa.com.
You can also find us on Facebook.
Oh, yeah.
Cometa Camera.
That's right, facebook.com/Cometa Camera.
YouTube at Cometa. Is it just Cometa on?
Yeah, it's Cometa Camera.
Just
search
Camera.
for us. You'll find our channel on YouTube. We've got lots of, we put all our podcasts on there for one. And we've got lots of educational videos, little camera reviews, previews, things like that. When we have trade shows in the area, we'll check them out. So there's plenty of info on YouTube. And then we've got Twitter, which is just at Cometa.
And then Instagram at Cometa Camera,
which we never have any original content on.
Yeah.
And then we also have our email if you ever want to get in touch with us, if you have any suggestions, blah, blah, blah. Just email social@cometa.com, because we are social butterflies, me and Nicole.
Oh, yes, totally.
We're the party animals.
All about that
Cometa
social
Camera.
media.
That's right. And I'll never see you outside of work, ever.
That's not true.
Well, once and twice.
I think once. Maybe twice.
Anyway, today's topic on Camera Academy is going to be image stabilization. And we've got lots to say about image stabilization.
Yes, we do.
Dagnabbit, I've got lots of opinions. And they're all bad. You kids today with your image stabilization and all your technology.
Back in my day, you wouldn't even have autofocus.
That's right. Back in my day, we had to use proper technique in order to stay
Technique.
steady. We had to buy more expensive films.
Technique.
Stop it. What are you doing?
You ever saw this SpongeBob episode when he was teaching Squidward how to blow bubbles?
No.
Oh, my God.
I'll just have to use my imagination.
How have you not seen that? That was one of the best episodes ever.
I'm afraid I didn't see it.
You need to watch it right after this.
I'm now into Star versus the Forces of Evil.
Never heard of it.
Excellent show on Disney XD.
Anyway.
I'm not going to give you the whole plot or anything.
That's fine. Continue. Image stabilization. I do remember we got some comments saying that we get sidetracked too quickly.
Yeah. So let's stick to the subject at hand today.
Squirrel.
Oh, look at his little tail. It's so fluffy. What were we talking about?
Image stabilization.
Oh, yeah. So the number one complaint that we get from tech support standpoint is your pictures are blurry. And there's obviously a number of reasons why that could be the case, but it's usually not because of focusing, because autofocus is pretty much infallible these days. That's where you jump in and agree with me.
Oh, is that what you wanted?
I wanted something.
I was too busy watching you get the remote.
And so focus is really not the issue. Usually the issue for blurry photos is movement, and if it's the subject that's moving, there's nothing you can really do about that except tell them to stand still.
Yes.
But the other culprit would be the photographer moving around.
And their hands moving around, which is going to make the camera move around if he's hand holding it.
That is correct. So that is the sort of issue that image stabilization has to address. Image stabilization will not Just so we
Yeah, disclaimer,
clear up
disclaimer.
this little misconception that some people have when they learn about image stabilization. It doesn't make things freeze in time. That's a fast shutter speed. You need a fast shutter speed to do that. Image stabilization compensates for the movement of the user.
Yes, we are not Magneto or anything here where you can make your subject stop moving for a certain period of time.
Be cool.
That would.
Especially if I just was played by Ian McKellen and I had that awesome voice. So some examples of blurry pictures caused by movement would be if you're indoors and you're using a relatively slow shutter speed because you don't have a lot of light, or in any other low light situation for that matter, and you're hand holding your camera, which most of us are almost all of the time, you are going to end up with some motion blur. And that's going to be because the shutter is slow and your hands are moving ever so slightly.
Yep, anything below usually like a 60th of a second, you're pretty prone to get that.
Motion blur.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for. Motion blur.
And then if you're in lower light situations, that is even more exacerbated by by slow shutter speeds. And if you're using a telephoto lens, those pictures can often be blurry, even if you're in really good light, because when you have a longer focal length, all those tiny little shakes, those tiny, tiny little movements that are almost imperceptible, those are magnified. Right. So hand-holding a telephoto lens at a relatively slow shutter speed, I mean, forget it. You're always going to have some blurring.
Yep.
And then you might just have shaky hands. You might not have really great technique. As you mentioned before. Maybe your lens and camera is getting a little bit heavy. You've been shooting for a long time. And maybe you're just walking around and you're trying to get some, action shots or candids, and you just happen to be bringing your camera up real fast and you're not holding it very still.
Yep.
All of these things can lead to motion blur, and it's all a result of the camera being in your hands at the time. And that's what image stabilization attempts to address. Now, I also want to mention that, yes, our boss just walked in and he gave us a weird sideways look. May I help you?
No.
I can edit this out. Okay. And then you have video. Okay, so when you're shooting video, you obviously want to have it nice and smooth. You don't want to have the jitters. But as is often the case, you end up getting the jitters. You get shaky footage, and that's almost impossible to avoid with a standard camcorder or camera when you're shooting video these days, especially with the size of the cameras themselves. Yeah, they're smaller, and like accessories you attach them just do not evenly distribute the weight properly, to where back in the day, like a VHS was like a shoulder rig, so it had some weight to it, so you're almost kind of like it's almost a tripod. You were almost like a tripod for the camera. Yeah, exactly. And for a lot of people, when they think about that, it's like, oh, it must be easier to hold something that's lighter and you wouldn't shake as much, but it's actually quite the opposite. When you're holding something that's really small, all those little shakes in your hand, that's the stuff that's magnified. Yep. And like you said, if you have something bigger that you can actually put on your shoulder or whatever, that makes it easier to hold. So image stabilization is very important for video, and we will get into that as well. So image stabilization, often abbreviated as IS, OIS, VR. In the case of Nikon, it's vibration reduction. OSS, which is optical steady shot for Sony. Everyone's got a name. They've all got a different one. VC is for Tamron. There's a whole bunch of different names. Abbreviations. And I just said the damn word, too. You said a bad word on podcast. That technology compensates for camera shake, and as we said, caused by hand holding, sometimes the wind, sometimes an unstable surface, like if you're on a boat or in a helicopter. For the few times in your life that might happen. I keep forgetting I have access to a pilot in a helicopter if I ever want to take pictures on one of those. Note to self, get in a helicopter with some kind of newfangledy lens or something like that. Yeah. And then we'll have a really cool video for YouTube. That would be fun. So let's just say that image stabilization... Take a sip of your Coke. Why am I not able to talk today?
I don't know.
All right. So, yes, image stabilization helps in all those areas. What it doesn't do is compensate for really big movements. So, those tiny little shakes in your hand, minimal movements, things like that.
Yeah,
but
nothing like drastic. You can't like shake it around like you're going to strangle it or something like that. It's just...
Yeah, exactly. If you're taking these, big, huge steps while you're shooting video, it's not going to compensate for, you can't run with a camera and expect it to look awesome.
Roll your feet, people.
You have
Roll
to.
your feet.
There's techniques for that, certainly.
Technique.
But yes, it's going to help, but it's not going to help in such a drastic capacity. So keep your expectations not low, but temper your expectations. It's not a magic wand that's going to come along and fix everything.
Especially if your subject is moving.
Especially if your subject is moving. It won't actually help that at all. So, and in the end, it'll help produce sharper images and smoother video. And it'll do so, it'll be measured and advertised in terms of stops. Now, when a camera manufacturer says, our lens will give you 4 stops of image stabilization correction, what does that mean exactly?
Basically, let's say you're shooting a picture at shutter speed of 1/100th of a second, f4. Basically, with image stabilization enabled, you'll be able to drop your shutter speed down lower and still get a stable image. Okay. So if it says 1 stop, you can click your shutter speed down once. If it says you can do 2 stops, you can click it down twice, and so on.
Okay.
So essentially, you get a steady. If you were moving your camera around like at 1/60th of a second a lot, you're going to tend to get a little shakiness in your pictures. So with that, you could actually drop it down to a 1/30th of a second, a 1/16th of a second, and you should still be able to get a nice steady shot with it.
That's great in low light situations.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty amazing the way camera technology has come forward, where now we are able to shoot in pretty dim conditions when you combine all the different things, the low light sensors, the size of the sensors, the image stabilization. What are we looking at here? SpongeBob and Patrick doing techniques.
Can't believe you've never seen that episode.
Animated GIFs are not exactly podcast material.
I was just showing you.
Nah.
I mean, I could play a sound clip, but is that going to get flagged?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Let's see if I can find it.
I think it has to be under a certain...
Don't forget the woo! Squidward! The spoon!
Wow.
You're not doing the technique.
Completely appropriate for today's topic.
Technique!
All right. So, let's just say, apart from that, the image stabilization is basically an advantage in every way. Having it available to you, there's no downside to it.
No. Having it available to you, there is no downside to it.
I mean, there's a couple situations where you wouldn't use image stabilization, and we'll save that for the end.
Yes.
That's a tease right there. Okay, so how does it work? Image stabilization can be applied in 2 different ways, generally speaking, lens-based and sensor-based.
There is another one.
There is?
But we don't talk about it.
Oh, yeah. We'll bring it up. And
maybe mention that little sly devil at the end.
Its name shall not be spoken of
within
these walls. But let's start with...
That shall not be named.
Let's start with lens-based image stabilization. This is favored generally by Canon and Nikon.
Mm-hmm.
They've been doing that for years. They actually started with image stabilization back in the mid-'80s. Mid-'90s.
Yeah, about to say mid-'90s.
Mid-'90s. And Nikon actually came out with the first camera that had vibration reduction, as it's called. And it was actually in a point-and-shoot camera, one that had a built-in zoom lens, and they built VR into that lens. So that was the first time it was done commercially, and then Canon came out with an IS lens the following year. So it's been around ever since then, and it's gotten increasingly better, of course.
Much better.
And basically, what it does is there are sensors and electromagnets inside the lens, and there's a floating lens element inside, and the motors inside will basically move that thing around. Not the motors, the electromagnets will basically move that element around so that it aims the light back towards the middle of the lens.
Correct.
It's basically just changing the optics to a certain degree, and it does a very nice job of stabilizing your image. In most cases, lenses are only able to do it on 2 axes, so left and right and up and down. It'll compensate.
There you
Thank
go.
It'll compensate for those movements, but it won't compensate for rotational movement.
Yeah, and on like bigger like telephoto lenses, they'll actually have different IS modes that you can switch to depending on how you're shooting.
Ooh. That's right. There is panning modes and things like that, right?
So if you're going strictly left to right, like you're at a football game or something like that, it'll pay more attention to image stabilization for left to right horizontal movements than vertical.
That's some pretty cool tech.
Right?
Yeah. So what are
You pay for it, too.
I know. You definitely do, especially with those big telephoto lenses. We'll get into that.
I bought my 70-200 f2.82 IS instead of a car one year.
Oh, my God.
Well, down payment on a car, but
well, it could have been a whole car, just not such a great car. But, all right, so let's talk about some advantages of lens-based image stabilization. First off, the system is made specifically for that lens at that focal length.
yes, so that means it's catered to that lens, so it's going to be the most accurate image stabilization you can possibly get for that lens.
Right. Now, I've heard, although I've not seen this in practice, that it works better with telephoto lenses.
I personally haven't done like a comparison to that, but like I just mentioned, that the telephoto lenses do have some more advanced technology in it as far as like when you need to pan specifically left to right, they'll have special modes for that, so it's like they're more catered to it.
As I understand, the conventional wisdom is, though, that lens-based image stabilization is better than sensor-based when you're shooting at long telephoto focal lengths.
I mean, like when you're shooting like wide angle or like normal photo lengths, your like image stabilization really isn't that kind of big of a deal because you should be able to get at a decent shutter speed with that.
Yes.
When you're shooting telephoto, just because you have that longer range, which means that your camera is going to shake more because of that extended range, that's where image stabilization is really needed.
Another advantage is that because the image is actually already stabilized by the time it gets to your camera sensor, your autofocus system will be a little bit more accurate. And if you're using an optical viewfinder, you can kind of see the difference between an unstabilized image and a stabilized image when you push down the shutter button.
Absolutely.
So those are some of the definite pros to lens-based IS. Now, there are a couple cons. First of all being...
Oh, actually, wait. There still is a pro, but it also could be a con, too, is kind of budget. Because,
well, yeah,
like, usually...
I was going to say this is a con.
Well, it's kind of a pro and a con because you can choose.
Okay.
So it's like an image stabilized lens, like say like a 70-200, there'll be several different versions of it. There'll be one with IS built in it, which will be the most kind of expensive. Then they'll have like another version of it with no image stabilization built into it, which will be a heck of a lot less money, but you'll still have the great like glass and quality of the picture if you need it.
Okay. So you at least have that freedom of choice there.
Yes.
As far as the cost goes, like you just said, image stabilized lenses are generally more expensive, and I'll just throw out an example here. There's a Canon lens. It's a 75-300 USM, and that lens is about $240, $250 or something like that.
And that has no
There's
IS
no
in it.
IS. It's just a standard lens. It's a good lens, but it's just a standard telephoto zoom. Now, there's an image stabilized lens that's a 70-300, basically the same exact focal range, has the same autofocus motor, and it has image stabilization built into it, and that's over $500. So that's twice the price of that lens just for adding in that image stabilization, which goes to show how important that feature is to a telephoto focal length.
Yes.
And people will pay that kind of money because when you're getting a lens like that, you definitely want to have that IS feature if you can afford it.
Absolutely.
All right, so the other form of image stabilization is sensor-based, or sometimes called in-body image stabilization. Now, that is sort of that was developed by Minolta in the early 2000s, and now that Minolta's gone, Sony bought out all their assets. That's a Sony technology that they use in all of their cameras. Olympus uses it, Panasonic uses it, and now even Fujifilm is using it. Canon, Nikon, I don't know. They're not
catch
exactly
up?
using it.
Maybe.
Maybe
some
they'll
point.
get around to it at some point, but most of the manufacturers, primarily of mirrorless systems, do use in-body image stabilization. And that basically works by, instead of moving lens elements inside the lens, moving the sensor inside the camera to compensate for movement.
Yes.
And there are a few advantages to that. First off,
Pretty much any lens you put on that now is an image stabilized lens.
right. So you can take an older lens, or a lens that's made to be inexpensive.
Prime lenses that usually don't have image stabilization built into them at all.
Right. And now you were saying before that, you might get lenses with shorter focal lengths, maybe something like a 35 millimeter, whatever, and you get those lenses because they have a really big aperture, and you may not necessarily need them to be image stabilized. But what if you want to do video? It would be great to have image stabilization on that lens, even if you don't use it all the time for still shooting.
Yeah, I mean, like the main reason, like I said that before, is because like with photography, I wasn't talking about videography. For photography, it's okay not to have that image stabilization built into those kind of lenses, because you're not going to really get as much camera shake with those focal lengths. I think we did explain that in our focal length video. Yes, no, maybe? I'm pretty sure we did.
Probably. That one was a long one.
Yeah, but with video, it's like any movement you make, because it's like consistently recording, you're going to see the bumps. So that's where you would want stabilization, like big time.
And then if you can have it, why not?
Yeah, why not?
And it sort of makes your entire lens, your entire camera outfit more affordable, because you don't have to have lenses with big expensive IS systems built into them. It's going to make them lighter, so you have a smaller, lighter system. And hang on,
Don't sneeze.
I had another point, but I can't remember. Oh yeah, so if image stabilization technology gets better, sensor based anyway, then you're only replacing a camera body instead of your lenses.
A whole bunch of lenses, yeah.
And camera bodies, as we know, they are much cheaper to replace than, say, a 70 to 200 millimeter lens.
Not only that, camera bodies usually start depleting in, cost as they get older.
Yeah,
Like,
the value will go down.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for. The value will go down, whereas lenses usually retain their value.
Right. So it would be nice to keep around all your lenses instead of having to sell them, I suppose.
Yep.
And you can sell them down the line. But yeah,
Keep them in good condition, though.
Overall, having in-body image stabilization is an improvement for your entire camera system. Now, one other pro that I should mention is that it will in-body image stabilization will generally correct for more axes than lens-based. So with lens-based systems, you get like up and down, left and right, like we mentioned before. And with sensor-based, you also get that rotational axis.
Yes.
So that's where
very
you get
important.
like their 3-axis image stabilization, and now with 5-axis image stabilization, because you combine everything together, you get some really good stabilization, and that comes just from the sensor. And it's really cool.
And not only that, with an in-body stabilization, you can couple that with lens stabilization.
Yes, you can. So like right now, Panasonic has their dual IS system. Olympus has a similar thing. It seems to be implemented mostly on crop sensor cameras, it seems, at this point.
I believe Sony has them too.
On the full frames?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you have both sensor-based and lens-based, you can get double the image stabilization.
Yes.
But
super mega steady shot.
of course, the systems need to be compatible with each other. So if you had a Panasonic camera,
You need a
have to have
Panasonic lens. You got a Sony system, make sure it's a Sony lens.
Correct. All right. So what cons do we have to a sensor-based system?
Cons, let's see. Why
I
didn't
can't
we start
think
with
of
the
any.
cons?
I can't
Yeah,
really
but
think of any.
it's hard to think of a con for that.
It's pretty good. Well, it's not as good for long telephoto lengths. That's basically the one con that I've seen.
Oh yeah, I mean it's not going to be as accurate as a telephoto lens with image stabilization built into it.
Right. So if you just bought yourself a 300 millimeter f2.8 lens and you're going to use it for football sideline pictures,
Yeah.
that's better to have it with the VR built into it than it would be if you just had that kind of telephoto length and all you had was sensor-based image stabilization. All right, and then like you said, there's the dual systems, the hybrid systems that put it all together, and then, as you mentioned earlier, and we'll bring it up because why not, digital image stabilization, electronic image stabilization.
Ooh, no.
This is something that you will find primarily on low-end point-and-shoots and video cameras. Now, with video cameras, it generally works pretty well. Basically because there is an excess of pixels when you're shooting video around the edges, and those extra pixels will be used to sort of like fill in the gaps. Electronic image stabilization works fairly well in video. However, with still photography, it really does next to nothing.
Yeah.
And sometimes it'll even decrease the quality of your images.
Yeah, it's just
It's a gimmick that doesn't really work.
it's That's all I can really think.
Yeah,
Just no.
because it's not really stabilizing your image.
No, it's trying to like.
It does some kind of interpolation, some digital magic to try and fill in the little gaps.
Which just doesn't work
And
right.
it doesn't work well with still images, because with still images you want as much detail as possible. With video you're going for smoothness.
Yep.
With still images rather, you want to have really nice crisp looking pictures, and digital image stabilization just doesn't cut the mustard. So that's basically been eliminated from all, not even just high end, but pretty much every consumer camera, unless you're going really kind of scraping the bottom of that barrel.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's all we have to say about digital image stabilization. I'm glad it's gone.
Yes.
So there it is. That's image stabilization. It's great. We love it. It keeps getting better. There are numerous ways in which it is implemented in current technology and current products, and we're just glad it's there because it helps in so many different situations, whether you're shooting telephoto or whether you're trying to handhold in low light situations. There's really no situation in which you wouldn't want to have image stabilization. However, there are some situations where you wouldn't use it.
Yes.
Now, what would be the primary reason?
The primary reason you would not want, the primary situation where you would not want to use image stabilization is if your camera was already in a situation where it was going to be steady, hence on like a tripod.
Yeah.
So if you're doing like product photography in the studio and you're shooting a still subject, like, I don't know, like a plate of food or something like that, the image stabilization, if you have that enabled while you're on a camera, while you're on a tripod, and it's not as bad as it was in the beginning, but if you have image stabilization on, basically you're saying that you're almost saying like I'm hand holding the camera, compensate for some of my shake please, because it's going to happen. The camera's already steady, so what's going to happen is when you half press that shutter and it starts engaging the focus, and it's going to start trying to do the image stabilization and trying to steady the shot.
It's like
it's
looking for something to stabilize.
When there's nothing to stabilize, so what's going to happen is
the solution in search of a problem.
it's going to shake that sensor, or it's going to move that lens element, and you're going to wind up getting some kind of blurry image when you definitely know it should not be blurry.
Yeah. So that's very counterintuitive, where you have your image stabilization on and you think, well, now I've got a tripod and image stabilization. That's going to make it extra steady.
Yes.
When in fact it does quite
not.
the opposite. It sometimes will even detect camera movements, like if your camera's mirror is moving or the autofocus motors or whatever. If you have a zoom lens that has an electronic zoom, it'll capture all these tiny little minute movements, and it'll try and compensate for those, and it'll overcompensate for those, and it'll produce motion blur on a completely steady camera.
Yes. So, I mean, like now, technology has gotten to the point where sometimes it can detect that it's steady. You said that there's some systems that have that in there.
There are newer lenses that will have a tripod mode or a tripod detection so that it can tell when your lens is actually on a tripod.
Yeah. But still, just for safety, I would always turn image stabilization off on your lens if you're on a tripod.
Yeah. And I should also say...
Unless you're shooting video, then you want that on.
It wouldn't be necessary.
It is.
Why?
I did with a wedding videographer friend of mine.
Okay.
Basically, whenever we're recording video with the 70 to 200s, we do have to move the camera around while it's on the tripod to like pan and stuff like that.
Well, if you're moving it.
Yes.
Well, yeah.
I mean, there's going to be spots where, you're moving the camera around, then you stop, then you're stopping it, you're locking it in, but you don't want to like turn, you don't want to click the image stabilization off at that point.
Okay.
And I just think that, and I've never seen it affect the video.
Well, yeah, because it's not going to produce any kind of severe jiggles or anything like that. So, yeah, when you're shooting video, there's really no need to turn it off.
No.
I agree with that. And the other thing I want to mention that should just be quickly noted is, like you mentioned before, some lenses have that tripod detection, but that's only a recent development. So you've got lenses that stay in the line for 10, 15 years. Those lenses that are still available at retail, are not going to have that kind of technology.
No.
So, like you said, best bet is that turn it off whenever it's on a tripod, and most lenses should have a little switch on the side where you can do so.
Yeah, and otherwise, like the newer like mirrorless cameras and stuff like that, the lenses don't really have switches on them.
Yeah,
so you have to dig through the menus, unfortunately, to find your image stabilization on that. But most systems have what's known as a quick menu function, where you can put the things that you use the most on a separate menu that's easily accessed. So that would be best to put one of those options.
So if your camera's on a tripod, turn off your image stabilization. If you're in a situation where you have just perfect bright lighting and you've got a nice wide open aperture and you've got a nice fast shutter speed going and everything's perfect, you don't have to have your image stabilization on. It's not going to help in that situation. And then one other situation when you might turn it off is if you want to conserve battery life.
Yes, it does suck battery pretty quick.
Yep. It's not just like a mechanical system. It actually uses, electronics, like I said, electromagnets earlier to move around the lens elements and the sensor and all that. So it's best to keep it off. If you're really running low on juice and you've done everything else, turn off the IS and see what you can do without it. So that is about it. Any closing thoughts on image stabilization?
Get it if you can afford it.
I mean, it's great. It's a great technology. It helps for all of us who have slightly shaky hands. It helps in low light situations. It's always getting better. More manufacturers are coming out with in-body image stabilization, except for Canon and Nikon. And it's really just a big help in almost every photography situation. I am glad it's here, and it's getting cheaper too.
Yeah, it's definitely not as expensive as it used to be.
Yeah, like you used to buy a high-end lens with image stabilization, and it would, how many digits are we talking about? Probably 5?
Yeah, around there.
Yeah, there were some really expensive
But I mean, like most cameras with their kit lenses have image stabilization in them too.
Yeah, and those don't obviously have the greatest system built into them.
But it's something.
But it's something, and it's helpful.
And it's there.
It's especially helpful as far as I'm concerned with video, because I do a lot of videography, and I love the way that image stabilization helps in almost all aspects, especially when you're using like mirrorless cameras and you've just got an LCD screen to work with and you have to hold it out in front of you. Image stabilization is a really big help.
Especially when you're feeding your chickens waffles and you have to record it.
Yeah, yep. Chickens move around a lot, so it's tough to keep track of them. And once again, doing the chicken head move over here on the Camera podcast, the Camera Academy podcast, I should say.
Yes.
Well, ready to wrap this up?
Yep, I think we're pretty good. Let's see if we can get this outro done correctly.
All right.
So, until next time,
we'll fix it in post.
Oh my! Yay! We got it the first time.
Oh boy, I'm so proud of myself. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. All right, bye.
Time for coffee.
Bye. Oh, Diet Coke.
Coffee.